So welcome everyone who has joined us for this fantastic webinar for Black History Month. I'm aware that one or two of you maybe have had some technical problems logging on. Hopefully you've all managed to overcome those problems now, and we have sent links to you. Tonight's important event is about reimagining the relationship between racism and religion, confronting our past, our faiths, inspiring positive change. We have an absolutely fantastic panel tonight to really address some of the questions around this. Let me introduce our panel. So first of all, we have Graham Campbell, SNP Councillor at Glasgow, the first African Caribbean person to be elected in Scotland. Has a deep involvement in community arts, practitioner in Black history, music, theatre, dance, and co-director of the African Caribbean Cultures Glasgow, being involved in the performances of the Emancipation Act, street theatre, during the Commonwealth Games, so many programmes raising awareness of Scotland's roots and history with slavery. So it's really great to have you, Graham. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Ian. It's great to be here.
I know you're very busy on the campaign trail as well just now, so it's great to have you. Joining us all the way from the States, is it Charlottesville you're in? I'm going to say this afternoon, morning, I'm not quite sure what time we're at, is Nancy Nelson, aka Nan-Lynn. She's a highly respected writer, actor, playwright, Broadway television star from New York. She's involved in education, being a director and creative consultant for the Children's Theatre Company in New York City. We'll talk more about that later because they do so many great programs, actually raising awareness and getting young people to tell their story, their narrative, especially around young African American people, and heavily been involved with wonderful shows like Henry Box Brown, the musical. And on top of all that, I don't know how you find the time to do that, also writing children's books like The Girl with the Giggling Hair. That's also been, a big issue about in schools and hair and people being, proud to wear their afro in all the arguments that are going on just now with school racist policies. You could argue around uniform and hair and things. Also thrilled to have Lisa Williams here, who's the director of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association, honorary fellow at Edinburgh University, and runs his wonderful Black History walking tours of Edinburgh and educational workshops in Scottish schools. I really need to get into one of these tours. It would be fantastic. I'm hearing so many great things. People, it's really raising their awareness. People are asking a lot of questions, and you really are challenging people on their history. We also have joining us Father James, is it Anyaegbu? How do you pronounce your last name?
Anyaegbu.
Okay. And some of you may recognise him from, it was a BBC documentary, Our Fathers, which aired earlier in March. And the documentary focuses on Father James and Maximilian, the two Nigerian priests sent on a mission to serve a large area of the north of Scotland. A bit of a culture shock coming from Nigeria into the Inverness weather, but I'm sure very beautiful scenery, and you'd be made at home. You certainly look, you're kitted out for Inverness weather now, James, with the nice sweater that you have there. So can I just say to people who are watching, if you have questions, please put them into chat and we will try and address them as we go along. We're going to start, first of all, with Lisa Williams. And we thought it would be good, Lisa, if you could tell us a little bit about the story of Malvina Wells, who is known as the only known person to be, I believe, born and buried in Edinburgh as a slave. She's buried in St John's Kirkyard. And it's one of the most prominent churches, obviously, in Edinburgh. And this might, in a sense, help us to connect with Scotland's connections with slavery and racism, especially as we talk a little bit about the topic of faith and its connections with racism. So let me share this presentation. I think Lisa has some images she wants us to see. Can you see that, Lisa?
Yeah, that's fine. We don't really need the first slide because it's just the introduction.
Okay.
So we're good from here. So thanks very much. Welcome, Ian, and thanks very much for everybody for tuning in. This is not a geography lesson, but just to give some people an idea of what is where, because not everybody's clear about what is where. We're going to be talking about a woman who came from a small island called Carriacou, which is very close to Grenada. So if you're looking close down towards South America, so if you look off the coast of Venezuela, you can see Trinidad, then Tobago, and then Grenada's just above. So Grenada's about 100 miles from the coast of South America. And then you'll see in a moment that Carriacou is a sister isle of Grenada. So next slide, please. Okay, so tiny little Carriacou is about 13 square miles. Graham knows it as well. I know Graham's been there too. So my mum's from Grenada. I lived in Carriacou for about 5 years, and I also lived in a tiny island just close to it as well, even smaller. So I know it pretty well. Originally, it was an indigenous spiritual centre, the indigenous people of that region who used to move around in canoes, and they all used to congregate together in Carriacou and have spiritual ceremonies there. It has strong connections with that notorious island, Bunce Island of Sierra Leone, where people were held for often up to 9 months before in one of the most horrible slave forts, and held for up to 9 months, and then would go across the Atlantic, Middle Passage, and go directly off into this island, Carriacou. And the reason why is because the Scottish consortium, Grant and Oswald, who were Glasgow merchants based down in London, actually had a lot of Scottish investors who were then able to invest in Carriacou when it changed hands from the French after 7 Years' War. In the 1760s, it went to British hands. The Scots moved into that very, very quickly. So you end up with a situation shortly after that, where you've got about 2/3 of the island owned by Scots, and particularly these two brothers, George and John McLean, who basically owned two-thirds of these plantations. Now, Carriacou is so small, but it's unique for a lot of reasons. One of them is because the enslaved people that were working there produced this top quality Sea Island cotton, which was imported often into Scottish mills like New Lanark, for example, and also a few other crops, but cotton was the main one. So next slide, please. And the other really unique thing about Carriacou is that the African traditions there are really, really strong. So they have this ceremony that they call the Big Drum, where people of different ethnicities who can actually trace their lineage back to very specific ethnicities. So things like Mandinka people, Cromanti, which is Fante and Ashanti people, Igbo, Congo, and Temne, and a couple of others. And it's unique in people being able to directly trace their lineage back. So often it's through the mother's line, sometimes it's through the father's line, like the Temne people who connect with Sierra Leone, it's through the father's line. And if you're able to see the slave register of 1813 from Carriacou, again, it's unusual because it doesn't only put the name of the person and other distinguishing features, but also the ethnicity of where people have come from. So if you go to Carriacou today and you're lucky enough to go to one of these ceremonies, you'll see how it happens. There's lots of videos online that you can see where people grow up knowing a specific drum rhythm, a specific dance that goes with their ethnicity, and people are called into the ring to do that particular dance. So it's one of the very few places where these African traditions are so strong for a lot of different reasons. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Now, Malvina Wells, this is her gravestone in the churchyard. It's quite easy to find. So when you go into the churchyard through the main gate from Princes Street and you turn left in that first area, you can see it there next to a larger one with the family, the McRae family, who was the Scottish family that she actually worked for. So Malvina Wells born in Carriacou as an enslaved person. She was what in those days you would have called mulatta. Father was Scottish, a man called John Wells, and her mother, we didn't know until quite recently much about her, but there's some research been done. There were some oral histories done about 20 years ago where people in Carriacou, the older people, was talking about a woman named Anne, who could have been her mother potentially. So people are starting to look into that a little bit more. Now, John Wells was working on a slave ship as a clerk, and he actually leaves the ship with one of those McLean brothers, and he gets a job on an estate in Carriacou. And not long after that, he starts to have children with a couple of enslaved women, and she has a half sister who's born around the same kind of time as well. So she's born around 1804, 1805. Now, if you go into the churchyard, you can actually read the lettering quite well. So as you can see, she lived in Edinburgh for such a long time, you know, until she was 82 years old. She came here as a young teenager, so she would have been about 13, 14, and ended up working not just as the head of the servants in the household, but also the nanny to the children. So she moves around from one family to another connected family. But in the middle of that, she actually shows up on the census in Edinburgh a few times. And in the middle census, she actually is living independently with another boarder who's like a lodger and a seamstress, and she's getting a pension from the family at that particular point. What is exciting is that we're starting to find, well, I am starting to find out more and more information. Obviously, other people have had this information for a while. I've been in contact with a lady who is a descendant from the McRae family, who's been doing a lot of research into this. And we're also being able to share this information with a friend of mine who's a descendant of Malvina herself. So he was really excited to hear some new information about her. So she lived for a long, long time. She did suffer from Parkinson's disease or something like that towards the end of her life. What's exciting about this as well, she actually goes back to Carriacou to go and visit family and come back again, which is really, really kind of unusual.
Especially
yeah, exactly. And there's a beautiful painting done of her, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, because there's this other painting. Those of you who came on my tour maybe a month ago or even before, I might have been showing you a painting, and I thought the girl in that painting was her, but there's more to the story. So next slide, please. Okay, so this painting here, which I was showing everybody as her until quite recently, it shows one of the family members, the mother who's now just been widowed, and her two girls, who she brings over to Edinburgh when they're a little bit older, maybe about the next year or so. Now, the girl in this picture actually is a girl called Dee Dee, who's in a similar kind of position to Malvina. She stays behind with the other brother who survives. So George McLean lives. She ends up living with George McLean, having children with George McLean. I'm not quite sure about what that relationship might have been like. Now, the family come over and they bring Malvina, or Mally, as she was known, with them. And one of the older daughter of those two children, when she grows up, she ends up marrying an MP from Edinburgh. And they're pretty wealthy, as you can imagine. They've all actually got slave plantation connections. So not just this family that got Carriacou connections, but also the same McRae lawyer. Father had plantations in Demerara in Guyana. So he's got an awful lot of money from his inheritance as well. Now, what's interesting about Malvina as well, she is able to save quite a bit of money, which is about £68,000 in our money today. And in her testament, she is able to leave some of the money to her sister, who she's still in contact with, and her sister's children, her nephew and niece. But the bulk of that money actually ends up back in the family again, because she stays with this extended family right through her life. She's living independently, and then she goes back to live now with another cousin of the family and their children. So all of the children in the family have spent time with her, kind of like as, you know, as the nanny and also the head of 7 servants, so she's getting paid quite well. And apparently she was a great watercolor painter, And there's an amazing painting of her, which unfortunately I can't share with anybody yet. I haven't got permission to do that. But it's such a beautiful painting where you see her in a really nice looking gown with a kind of silk bonnet, and she's there with these girls who are now teenagers, and she's holding a music book in her hand, and she may have been a music tutor to them as well. So next slide, please. This is image of the census, 1851. You might not be able to see very well, but if you go about halfway down, just below the middle part, you'll see the name Malvina Wells, hopefully there. And you can see that she was recorded as being born in Grenada, which of course Carriacou is part of, and lady's maid, as she's referred to there. So next slide, please.
Wow.
And this is the death certificate from 1887, where she's 82 years old, and it lists her father, John Wells. So we're trying to find out a bit more about him. The McRae lady has filled in a few of the gaps about who he was, like in fact going over on a ship, because he has a couple of journals where he actually mentions meeting this McLean man and getting a job on the plantation. Now, she also ends up with quite a few half siblings from the father, and quite a few of those children end up coming over to Scotland and going up to Aberdeen and getting educated and going back to Carriacou and things like that. So all very much connected with Scotland right until the end there. So I think that's my last slide from that. I think you had asked me, I don't know if I've got time, but I think you'd also asked me, Ian, to mention Frederick Douglass a little bit.
Yeah, well, a lot of people,
if you've got time.
A lot of people have been asking questions.
Okay.
Obviously, we know that the great preacher and abolitionist Frederick Douglass went on a speaking tour of Scotland. I think he spoke in Perth, and also I think he stayed in Gilmore Place.
Yes, he did.
In Edinburgh. I wondered, even briefly, you know what effect that might have had.
Oh, huge effect.
In Scotland.
Huge effect. Yeah, huge effect. So he came over. He's born in Maryland in 1818. He ends up being helped by his first wife, Anna Murray Douglas, who's a free woman of colour up in New York. She helps them to escape. She organises his disguise to get onto a train. They get married a few days later. And he writes his autobiography where he names and shames what's happened on the plantation and all the traumas. And it's probably a good time for him to get out of America at that point. So he's invited to come over. He's also helped by the Edinburgh Ladies Emancipation Society, who are an incredible group, Quakers. So you get this kind of like transracial solidarity happening, real assistance. They help Harriet Tubman and various other African-American abolitionists. He comes over. He stays over in Bruntsfield and Gilmore Place with the plaque up a couple of years ago. And his big rallying cry while he's here is for Thomas Chalmers, who's the head of the Breakaway Free Church, as you would know, in 1843, to send back the £3,000 that they have solicited from Scottish American slave owners or enslavers in the southern US, and using that, the hypocrisy of using that money to then go and start a free church. And so his big rallying cry when he's here, when he's making these speeches, and it's all over Scotland, Ireland, the rest of Britain, but a lot around Edinburgh, where his rallying cry is to send back the money, to send back the bloodstained money. And he takes two of the women from the society, he calls us two Quakeresses. They go across to Salisbury Crags, and with help of homeless kids in the park, get these massive shovels, and they carve out huge letters into the grass, send back the money. And that's in the middle of the night. So you can imagine the next morning the kind of stir that created. And although the money never went back, what it did is raise the abolitionist cause, because you had Scots very much on both sides of the Civil War, but that's another story. He actually comes back again in the 1860s with also other African-American abolitionists as well.
Wow, it's great also to hear the story of how the Quaker movement was involved, very much so they are. We've heard some great stories in Quaker history of being involved in abolitionist cause. Really interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm sure there'll be some questions that people will have, and our panel might also want to come in at some point. I think we're all learning little bits about our history as we go on. Graham, can I turn to you next? I know you look like you're officially You might want to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
The most common thing of the world. How many words do we spend on mute? I don't know. We've a couple of questions. I'll bring Lisa back in a minute as well in terms of the curriculum. Maybe we'll deal with that together. And you've done an awful lot of work, Graham, highlighting Scotland's role in the slave trade. I'm interested, first of all, today obviously we're talking also from a faith perspective, but how does your Rastafarian belief motivate you to challenge racism? How much of that is behind your kind of philosophy?
I would say it's obviously quite central to it, but I'm not quite sure how. I mean, for a start, obviously I'm a believer, but I'm not in a community. Right. So that's the first thing. Rastafarianism is a collective endeavor, but it's also non-structured. So you don't have a high priest, you don't have an official structure, theologically, you are sovereign to interpret, what you understand as your purpose and Jah's will is. And I should have begun by saying, greetings, of course, Jah Rastafari, for the blessings and praises that he gives us and for our lost ancestors and souls that we remember. I am only here because of them. So that's something that Rastafari teaches me, that in fact that I am a survivor of some very worthy ancestors who fought and died for their freedom, and I am lucky enough to have been born in this time so that I can carry their genetic and cultural legacy forward. So I am aware that Rastafari makes me aware of it, that I'm a representative of that line and those generations of people who've suffered to allow me to have the life that I have. And I'm very consciously aware all of the time, because I have family back in the Caribbean, and I have family members in Nigeria and the United States, in Canada. I'm fully aware of how lucky we all are to be able to live where we do and not live in the poverty that we came from in the northern coast of Jamaica. And the division that we had from slavery and from the social structure that the colonial masters imposed upon us, and those colonial masters were in very large percentage Scots on Jamaica. And we have to acknowledge that the divide and rule that they imposed upon us, the internalized self-hatred they inspired within us to hate our own race and our own people, has had a long-term, hundreds of years long impact on how we perceive ourselves. And in many ways, the faith I come from is about spiritual and theological, as well as a historical rebuttal of everything that white supremacist civilization stands for. When Bedward and Howell, the two men who founded the faith, were going around in the 1930s saying that Marcus Garvey is the prophet, and that His Royal Highness, His Imperial Majesty, was the living God. When they were saying that, when they said that the prophecies in the Bible say that these men represent those prophecies, they were thought of as mad. Now, this was in the days before Locke, so this society in which the white elite dominates, in which the black culture and the black people are denigrated because that's a survival from slavery. They may not be in slavery right now, but in the 20th century, they were subordinate. They were culturally vandalized in their minds. So they straightened their hair, they relaxed their hair, they cut their beards off, and they appeared and did everything they could to be like Europeans, because that was part of the British Empire. And that cultural self-hatred, that imbibing of a lack of value in ourselves as people, struggled with us right through that century. It was only Marcus Garvey's stance as our liberator and as our pointer of the direction where Jamaican society was going. Of course, everything that he stood for was promoted fear in the white establishment. So Rastafari was established in that point of the beginnings of anti-colonial struggle, but also a nod to the fact that in Africa there was a kingdom that was not colonized, that was not run by Europeans, that had a civilizational background going back generations. In fact, you could say, and Rastafarians did say it, Bedouin said it, that the Western civilization, so-called, got its civilization from Africans, that it got its religion from Africans, that it got its Christianity from Africans, that it got its spiritual soul, its education and learning from Africans. They even said that genetically that Africans were the ancestors of those people. Now they were laughed at, in fact, so laughed at that Rastafarians were literally put in lunatic asylums to lock them up and shut them up. They were forcibly shaved. In those days, we wore beards because there were no locks at that point. It was beard. Being bearded was itself. That's why I'm growing a beard now. Being bearded itself was a symbol of your rebellion against Western civilization. So what did? They washed them, forcibly washed them in showers in cold water and shaved off their beards. That's what they did to Rastafarians, as well as destroying their villages. We had collective villages in the hills. We went to where the free slaves were, and we took land to establish free communities at places like Pinnacle. We tried to live outside the white man's system. We tried. They wouldn't let us. They went deliberately out of their way. The Jamaican authorities, this is in post-independence, to destroy our communities. And these are communities that were self-reliant economically. What Garvey told us is that it wasn't just enough to be spiritually liberated and look to Africa for your liberation, obviously, as your guidance. You want to return to Africa both physically and spiritually. But it wasn't just enough to do that. You had to live as independently of their economics as you possibly could. Now, having a philosophy and a religion that relates to that was really important. So, of course, all of these things guide my thinking about this and the way I've always done my politics and the way I've always fought racism, because I think it's important to have a sense of how do you feel Black empowerment is important? How do you feel it's actualized in actual struggle? And how do you feel that your allies in that struggle respect the spiritual and political values that you come from? Now, of course, Rastafari is known internationally mainly because of Bob Marley, right? It's a daily occurrence of mine to get mistaken for Bob Marley, or childishly people say, I can walk between Central Station in Glasgow to my house, and in that 10-minute walk, at least 3 or 4 people will say it under their breath as if I can't hear them. It's very annoying. It happens in my own city. It doesn't happen when I go somewhere else. So it's frustrating, but it's indicative that they can put you in a box that they understand. And this is the thing. Racism is about stereotyping and understanding, and all right, that fits into this very limited store of knowledge I've got about you, and that encapsulate what you stand for. So you get asked the obligatory question of if you smoke and what do you smoke and how much do you smoke and how much of it is your head in. Well, I actually don't smoke at all, and that's not a requirement of the religion. So it's a frustrating thing to do, but it requires challenge. Always it's about challenge. Any theoretical or spiritual life requires challenge to the surroundings that you find yourself. You have to carry yourself in a certain way. And I've had to do that in many circumstances where I am the only Black person in the room. And that does give me strength. There's no doubt that it gives me strength, because I kind of call this my hijab. That's my war paint. That's my, these are my weapons to go into spiritual battle with what I consider to be evil. Racism is a deep evil, and it's a deep pandemic that people don't realize they have.
Yes.
By bringing to light that slavery legacy, and the slavery legacy in Glasgow and of course in Edinburgh, as Lisa's pointed out, is vast. And and I welcome the chance to talk about this in a spiritual sense, because I don't often do. As a politician, it's always deadly to talk about your religion. And
you're safe.
Well, I'm very safe here. I'm very glad for it. The obvious point, though, is that I've been involved in work around the slavery legacy of Glasgow, about Glasgow University and what we've done there. There's a whole heap of things. For those who don't know, we've obviously done a slavery study 2 years ago, which led to the decision to set up a slavery studies centre. Dr. Stephen Mullen's work was used to investigate the origins of the donations that made the Gilbert Scott building, the main campus building. It's on a slave plantation owner's land. Robert Bogle owned slaves in Jamaica. That's where his work came from. Glasgow University gets built on his land. And those, Gilmore Hill and Kelvin Grove are actually the names of these 2 slave masters' houses, which are joining each other, and that's where Glasgow University was built. So a plaque now marks that as a part of the ceremony we had last year, which was the Memorandum of Understanding between Glasgow University and the University of the West Indies, an agreement to set up what was launched yesterday, the Beniba Centre for the Study of Slavery, or Slavery Studies, I should say. That is the institution that the Glasgow University agreed to set up as a 20-year bequest of £1 million a year over 20 years to make sure that the more evidence is brought to light about the slavery legacy. And I'm incredibly proud that we've done that, because that has its origins in lots of people fighting for many years, but specifically the study was asked for in 2015 under my flag up hat when we approached the University Senate. We asked them, well, look for some evidence of the links to slavery. And they concluded, right, we'll fund the study. They employed Stephen Mullen. Stephen Mullen did the study. He found that £200 million worth of donations in today's money were given by about 25 large benefactors who all had their origins in slavery money. And they donated to the fund that built that building. A similar study has been commissioned for Glasgow City Council, also by Stephen Mullen. He's working on it right now. It's been delayed a bit because of COVID lockdown, locking up the museums, galleries and libraries. But I'm hearing that as of next week, they'll finally reopen so that Stephen can continue his work. We're looking at the role of Lord Provosts of Glasgow. Many of them were tobacco merchants and sugar merchants, so therefore they were deeply mired in slavery. There's one particular one called Andrew Cochrane, whose name is on the street next to Glasgow City Chambers. I actually enter the City Chambers every day with a reminder of his name, because I have to go in that entrance to get to work. So every day I mention that man's name and I want it gone. But that's how I feel. But his legacy is that as the 3 times Lord Provost in the 1770s, when he died, he'd been 3 times Lord Provost. He was a tobacco merchant. He set up one of the banks. He was definitely responsible for a lot of evil. But there's his name up there on the street, and he's not the only one. Buchanan, Ingram, Miller, they're all there. There's nothing to say who they were, and most Glaswegians walk around not knowing who they were. The statues in George Square, I mean, the statue debate has gone on for a lot of the summer for some obvious reasons. Black Lives Matter has made us listen to these things. But I go along with the idea that every name and every street name could be changed. But if the evidence disappears, then there's a chance to forget it. The problem of Glasgow, and indeed of Edinburgh, has been the organised forgetting about the slavery legacy. So if we change or remove statues and street names, how do we remember it? And the answer, of course, is that we have to have a slavery museum, or at least a museum of slavery, empire and colonialism. And now it's the official position of the council, as a result of the motion I passed last month, that it's the position to have a museum to recognise the 3 main demands of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is around decolonising the curriculum, tackling institutionalised racism, and dealing with issues like in schools, racial attacks and incidents in schools, challenging racism in practice, in the outcomes of things. So it's certainly, my faith certainly inspires me in all of those fights, and I think without it, I wouldn't have stayed the very long course that it has been.
Wow, there's a lot to digest there. Just closing something down there. While you were talking there, we actually had a question from Joe, which was asking if Glasgow University should do more. It was mentioned that university donated 20 million to the West Indies for reparations. I'm not sure that's what they're calling it, for their own the slave trade. But you have mentioned obviously that they have set up this the centre now to look into the history of slavery. Is there more you think that can be done by the council?
I think we have to understand these things as a series of related but connected acts of reparation. And I see reparations as a process of 4 or 5 A's, acknowledgement, awareness raising, atonement, acceptance, then apology. Often people ask for the apology first, and I think the apology first is no point, because people wouldn't understand why they're giving an apology without the other things happening first. So I understand us that we're somewhere in the apology, atonement, acceptance area where we're trying to get the facts of the legacy out there, facts of our involvement as a nation. There's been a historical forgetting that Scotland's a perpetrating nation, not victim here. There's a need to then get the acceptance in amongst the public so that they then reassess who they are as a people. Because the perception that a Scots person is a white, Anglo-Saxon, Nordic, Viking type person is strongly ingrained in the culture, of course. But it's not true, because everybody who's here is an immigrant at some point in their life. You know, the question is where do all those cultural influences and different diverse cultures come from in Scottish history? And one of those key ingredients has been our contribution. And having Scots recognise their contribution as empire colonialists everywhere else should change their view of what is a global Scot. Because there are people all over that planet, whether they're in the Caribbean, West Africa, South Asia, indeed Hong Kong, who have Scottish names and ancestry because Scots were the colonial activists over there creating British international trade and sea power. Therefore,
it's
saying that they're responsible.
I think there's been a lot to try and challenge that mindset that almost Scotland has this notion of we're all Jack Tamson's bairns, this whole idea of everybody's equal, and it's almost as if we've been dragged into the empire and we weren't involved in these things, and it's just through the work that that you and Graham and others are doing that is bringing to light actually the truth of the history, that as you say, we were playing a leading part. We weren't just a innocent bystander in this. Interesting comment from Benjamin Carey, who's saying that your explanation of being a survivor sounds very Jewish, but with less guilt. Having lost many of his family in the Holocaust, it helps him to relate to it. It's very interesting just to take that in. And Bonnie's saying facing the colonial past is essential if we are to make changes. Thank you so much for that. Now, can I ask a question about where we are with, so you've mentioned the fact that you feel that there should be a slave museum. I had an interview with Hamza Yusuf, the Justice Minister, who would echo that, the feeling that the statues should be removed, that they should be placed in a museum. The people should have a chance to come and be educated on that. Where do we stand in the curriculum? What should we be doing in the curriculum? And Lisa, you might want to come in at some point in this. Many people would argue that the curriculum doesn't reflect Scotland's role in the slave trade. There are also one of the tensions that I have, and I'm aware from many of my friends as well, is that we don't just simply want Black civilization of Black culture to be remembered just as a slave trade. I mean, Graham, you've encapsulated a really great point. Is that, who knows about Ethiopian civilization? Most people do not know of the great civilization that came out of Ethiopia, the very learned, developed civilization that was there, that was unconquered by other countries, the learning that came from there. Very often people still have the mindset that the white colonialists brought Christianity to Ethiopia and Africa, when in fact, Christianity was there for long before. What would you like to see in the curriculum? What would you like to see in the curriculum, in a nutshell? Get that balance.
We just must start with an accurate history of the country. And once you start with that, and you take all the sources from other civilizations, from other peoples, the non-white male patriarchal voices, you will get an accurate history of the country. But also it helps people center themselves correctly in that environment that is the world. That's why it's essential. It will be spiritually and theologically and socially good for Scottish people to know that and own it, and therefore deal with it. Because otherwise you're dealing with the perpetual denialism of people who've been advantaged by white supremacy trying to deny the fact that they've been beneficiaries of this. And I try and break it down by pointing out that, of course, I'm one of the beneficiaries of this white supremacy, partly because I've grown up as a European citizen. So I've had access to these things that many of the citizens from the countries that I have origins in do not have in their countries. And I make that point that think of all the Jamaican nurses you've had all over the years. 700,000 of them have come over the last 70 years. And Britain's not paid for 1 penny of their training or education back in Jamaica. Jamaican taxpayers who paid for that. And they've never been compensated for any of that. So having some sense of understanding of how much, not just in terms of material resources, but in terms of human resources and the lives that we've made and the contributions we've had to make to build Britain and Scotland the way it is. So we need that curriculum to reflect that history. We just do. Therefore, the motion that I talked about last month also mentioned the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights 5 points that it put in its letter to the First Minister, demanding a change to the curriculum for excellence, specific educational attainment goal for, having an awareness of the slavery legacy and history of other African and non-white civilizations as part of that learning curriculum aim. They've had a bit of a knockback, a bit of a brickbat defence from the government, but that's not enough. So the council supports Claire's position, and we're going to go back again and demand they change it. They must change it.
Great. Lisa, do you have anything else from an academic view on the curriculum or history?
Yeah, a few things, and also just from experience of taking teachers and young students around on tours, like 12, 13-year-olds ask the best questions, actually, because the mind's still very open. They're not afraid of being wrong. So I actually been asked by Edinburgh Council to do some work, sort of heading up a strategy for the next 3 years on looking at decolonising the curriculum, like within Edinburgh schools, which is going to be great once they put the money where their mouth is, and actually that we do it, which should be amazing. So yeah, exactly what Graham was saying, I'll second that, bringing in different perspectives. There's so much scholarship from the Caribbean, from Africa, and making sure that we looking at their resources as well, because often when I go into schools and work with teachers, they're underconfident about teaching. They don't have the resources. They don't know what they feel confident, they don't feel confident in what resource to use. The other thing that's important is how you deliver this material as well, and make sure the teachers are trained to deliver it sensitively, so that you don't end up making situations worse or making maybe the one black child in the classroom feel more alienated than they already are. So those things have to be confident about. The language that they use is a big thing. What kinds of images that you show, whether they're dignified images, whether they're, when I'm teaching primary school kids, I will use a general from the Haitian Revolution, a young female general, rather than somebody in a loincloth begging for freedom, with chains around their hands. So the kind of imagery used is really key. What you introduce first is really key. So again, as Graham was saying, those important civilizations, but also everyday life as well. So one of the things I talk about is the universities in Timbuktu that were thriving a couple of centuries before St. Andrews. And some of those same Islamic scholars who end up in the Caribbean and who were major intellectuals when they left are then not allowed to continue their faith. And of course, some of them ended up in America eventually when they were able to write their memoirs and get translated, and so on, people kind of find out about their lives. So yeah, really good resources, collaboration with heritage institutions. So one thing is, important to have a museum that concentrates on this history, but I do a lot of work with other existing national regional institutions as well, heritage institutions. So I'm doing some work with National Trust, V&A Dundee, and working also with the National Museum at the moment. So making sure that when people go into those places, those histories are reflected. So it's backing up and making it easier for the teachers, and maybe making it easier for the parents as well. So it's important that we make sure those things are connected. One last thing I will say is, again, it's connected for young people to understand the development of places like Scotland the flip side of that is the underdevelopment, the structural underdevelopment of the Caribbean, where people are really still suffering. And like Graham was saying, the kind of brain drain of Jamaican nurses coming over here and that creating a problem the other end. Making sure that people understand that, and understanding the unfair trade practices is key. For me, reparations would be about debt cancellation, making sure we've got fair trade practices, making sure that governments are working on that kind of level. So we can have these small things coming from universities and different institutions. But until those things are sorted out, that kind of continued structural underdevelopment will continue. So it's important for our young people to prepare them for proper global citizenship and to create better relationships around the world, to make sure that those young people here from all backgrounds are equipped in understanding those things.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Just very quickly, someone has asked, should we have other Benaba type centres across Scotland? Is there a way that the Glasgow model could be, obviously they might not have the funding to do that, but maybe down the line there's a way of looking at different cities across Scotland, establishing maybe some department in the universities or some courses or something to look at their history?
Lisa will know what's happening in Edinburgh, but I'm pretty sure that this is a conversation happening with lots of other universities. Certainly it's happening in a lot of cities. Dundee has agreed to set up a sort of committee of Black lived experience, similar to the one that we've done in Glasgow. I'm now in charge of a consultation on this question, actually. So on the names, on the street names, on the museum. So that's now going to go public at some point, hopefully in the next few months, once Stephen's study has been published. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'm quite sure, though, that Greenock will have a claim, because I've been speaking to them, and they want the National Slavery, Colonialism, Empire Museum to be there. As I want it to be in Glasgow, but I think there's a definite case, though, for having a multi-site national institution that happens, that has one in a branch in Glasgow, a branch in Edinburgh, a branch in other places that are important to the slavery legacy. So I'm easy about that, but something along the lines of what the V&A does or the Tate does, multiple sites, multiple locations, but perhaps one national institution, that could be way. But I'd like it to be headquartered in Glasgow. But hey,
someone is saying, did you see 700,000 nurses from Jamaica? Many nurses, did you say, Graham? Someone was just asking.
Over the last 70 years, 700,000 nurses have come to Britain. 700,000 nurses, Martin. Quite incredible, staggering figures. Moving on briefly, because I think we could talk here all night. I'm going to bring in Nancy. I know must be fascinating for you listening here, what's going on in Scotland. Obviously, America, there are major issues, and I'm not even going to touch on the American election and what that's going to do for things. But obviously, you've done a lot of work in theatre and the arts, educating people to learn about their history through children's books, like The Giggle with the Giggling Hair, but also in these big productions that you've worked on, like Henry Box Brown, and also some of the plays that you've written. Starting with a similar question that I've asked Graham, how does your Baha'i faith motivate you in challenging racism through the arts? Because obviously you're coming from a Baha'i background, although I think you grew up in the Baptist church, is that right?
I did. Well, first of all, thank you, Ian, for having me here and being among this esteemed panel. Excuse me, it's very interesting. I am learning quite a bit from what I've heard so far. The parallel is very interesting to me with what's happening here and the history and all of that. It really is quite astonishing, because this whole notion of race is pure illusion, and the history, the death, the criminality that has been born out of this illusion of race is just, it boggles the mind. There has been scientific study that race is non-existent. as a member of the Baha'i faith, one of the main tenets, really, the foundation of which this faith is founded, is that there is no such thing as race, that there is only one race, which is the human race, right? That we are all part of this one divine creation, and we are all human beings equally endowed with the divine creation of illumination, of virtues, of just human capacity to love one another. But of course, you know, when, because we have free will and the minds of men take over, you know, I think it sort of sends us down these like very crooked paths and these rabbit holes, and some of our darker selves sort of emerge, you know, hatred and fear mongering, and then you use things like money to become the root of evil. You know, you enslave people for economic reasons. And so on my spiritual journey in my life, I was born in a Baptist family, as you mentioned, Ian, and went to church and loved it because it was very lively and spirited, and those are my roots. But I realized that there was something missing, and so just, you know, trying to figure out what it is, not even really being conscious of it, but knowing that there was something missing, I sort of went on this spiritual journey, if you will. And I happened upon the Buddhist religion, the Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, which I held on to for about 5 years. And I think it served its purpose in my life until I got to a point where I felt like, it still wasn't fulfilling me in a way that I was feeling it needed to. But I loved the ritual of it. I loved the ceremony of it. I loved having, you know, my gohanzen and, you know, everything that came with that, the chanting and everything. So I went back to my Christian roots, actually, and sort of became this born again Christian, if you will. And found that very quickly found that was not resonating with me at all. So then being an actor, you know, this is all happening parallel. Being an actor, I was at an audition one day and I ran into a gentleman who was also auditioning, and he introduced me to the Baha'i faith. It was the first time I ever heard of the Baha'i faith. And of course I thought he was crazy. He's telling me about a religion that I'd never heard of before. So how can that be? But it just so happens we were both cast in the same play. I got to know him and got more information about the faith. I ended up marrying him, learning more about the faith. And because one of the other tenets, there are several, but one of the other tenets is the individual investigation of the truth, right? So no matter what this one individual tells me about the Baha'i faith, it is incumbent upon me to do my own investigation, because there is no clergy in the Baha'i faith. There is administrative bodies that sort of hold the community together locally, nationally, and internationally. But as an individual Baha'i, it is incumbent upon us to really study and find out the truth for ourselves about the faith and who the founder of the faith is, who is Baha'u'llah, who founded the faith. The Bab, who was sort of the forerunner, kind of like twin manifestations, who came just before Baha'u'llah to actually say, there is someone coming who is much greater than I am, but I'm sort of preparing the world for you right now. And so when Baha'u'llah came, that's when the actual dispensation of the Baha'i faith started. And so as I started doing my own, going along my own path, my own spiritual path of the Baha'i faith, and reading it, everything just sort of resonated with me. The unity and oneness of humanity, that's just foundational, and I always thought that, I always felt that, this notion of, one group of people being better or being, chosen over another group of people didn't sit right with me. This whole notion of race and the impact that it has on people of color. Graham talked about the self-hatred that is a byproduct of that. When you're growing up in a country that has this social structure that is completely false, but we're all victims of it. And my victimization of that is being told that I'm less than, really has such a profound impact. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy on post-traumatic slave syndrome, but she is a doctor, PhD of sociology, and her work is just phenomenal. But when I first heard the phrase post-traumatic slave syndrome, it just stopped me in my tracks, because I thought somewhere in my DNA recognizes what that is and what that means, and I want to know more. And it really is about the trauma, the generational trauma that the enslaved person in Africa and all of the countries, the Caribbean and everywhere, who had enslaved people. It's the generational trauma that is embedded in our DNA that continues with us, because of course the trauma never really ended, right? I mean, we are still being traumatized, because the system may have sort of mutated into something a little different, but there's still this systematic racism that we are all impacted by. And so I hope I'm not getting too far off your question, which I really, perhaps I am.
Yeah. I think I'm with you. Can I ask you, just kind of moving it along, and what role does the theatre and the arts play then? And you talked about the systematic racism, and what role does the theatre and the arts play in challenging that? How do you educate young people through the theatre and the arts?
Yeah,
to challenge a voice.
Theater to me, first of all, is like the ultimate art form, right? I mean, it just encompasses and encapsulates so much. And as a Baha'i, the arts are very high on our way we live our lives. Creativity is very important. And I've been working with young people for about 20 years now. I've been in the business of show for over 40 years. But the 20 years that I have worked with young people has been the most impactful and the most rewarding for me, because it does help allow children to really see their potential, to live into their potential, to be able to express themselves. The arts help with their academic proficiencies, their literacy, their cognitive skills, their ability to analyze. One of the things that the Children's Theater Company talks about is how theater is a tool for moral reasoning, right? I mean, to be able to present these historical stories like Henry Box Brown, as you mentioned, which talks about an enslaved man who, out of his desperation, as all enslaved people were, to escape, mailed himself in a crate to Philadelphia to escape slavery, right? Now, as dark as our history is of slavery in America, this story really is about the triumph of the spirit, of the human spirit. And so what we did with that particular story is we presented it. It was a wonderful, amazing musical. It was at the Edinburgh Festival. It won awards and lots of recognition. And then we also here in the United States would engage our audience in conversation about that. And because the Baha'i Faith has created this room to talk about race, because one of the things about the Baha'i Faith is we consider race the most vital and challenging issue facing America today. So when you become a Baha'i, you come in with that understanding. That doesn't mean that everyone comes in at the same level of understanding, but at least coming in knowing about that. And so we engage our audience in these conversations about race, racism, the systematic effects of it. And when they've just watched something like Henry Box Brown, it's emotional. You know, theater is a communal experience. The audience is ripe for conversation. People want to talk, you know, people want to engage with each other. And so that's the power of theater, and using it to be able to tell these dark stories, but always sort of end up with hope. And as a playwright, that's what I always like to do. I mean, you can go deep dark, because it's the truth, you know, like both Graham and Lisa was saying, you know, without the truth, we're lost completely. And truth means facts, right? So we have to educate people to be able to have really honest conversations. And so when I'm working with young people, which is always a privilege for me, I just try to make sure that I'm being honest with them, I'm being genuine with them, that I am learning from them as much as they're learning from me, from in terms of their craft. And I just find that theater really sort of does it all. You know, it does the writing and the dramatic interpretation. And just one last thing about theater itself and the history of theater, that it comes from the ritual of Ethiopia, of Egypt. You know, a lot of people think theater started, you know, Greece. I mean, Greece sort of turned it into sort of what it is today, but they got that from the Ethiopian rituals. And you still see it today in a lot of African-American communities and the art that is created in the African-American community. So, so that's it. You know, theater is just, you know, where a person can come and really find their nobility, which is the kind of theater that I really like to engage with young people.
The one thing I'll say with Henry Box Brown, I don't know if anybody here has seen it, but it takes you on a heck of a journey, and every emotion from tears to hope, as you say, hope, when, you know, he hears a man enslaved who loses his family and children, and
right. He does it with the help of white people, with the abolitionists, right? And people that he sent to in Philadelphia, you know. So, you know, it is a triumph of the spirit of not just the Black person, but they put their lives in danger as well to even assist him in his journey. You know, so it's a wonderful example of how we can all work together.
But I've never been in theatre plays where what you do at the end is, rather than the show and let everyone go away and digest, the actors come out, bare their souls, and then ask you to ask the questions and reflect on how you feel watching that show and the journey that's taken you on. I think there's a lot of power in that, and maybe that's another vehicle that we need to try and use. That kind of education system in our schools would be incredible, Nancy. Some of what you're doing in the States here, maybe to take some of the children that we have in Scottish schools to learn a bit about their, you know, the past and the role in slavery and racism, and then at the end, you know, you can just connect in their lives with their present.
Absolutely. It's a very powerful model. We also do what's called open-ended plays, where you can present a story up to a certain point and then have conversations about how would you end that story.
Wow.
Right?
Right.
Engage with the students, what they've already seen, something that's racially charged or whatever, and then have them engage in conversation about the best way to go about ending it. And it creates wonderful, wonderful consultation and mind expanding thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm hoping maybe in the future there's a way to link you up also with Graham and Lisa. Maybe when we look again at the education system, maybe there's something really special, dynamic that we could do that takes the learning of what you're doing in schools in New York to here. Thank you so much, Nancy. Just great to have you here. James, you've been sitting, Father James, you've been sitting there patiently. Thank you so much taking all this in. I just want to ask you a couple of questions, and just before we'll bring a couple of people in from the audience to ask people, and then we'll come to a close. I was watching a great program recently on Ethiopia, and we've talked a lot about Ethiopia today, and it was making a point, that Christianity was there long before the white colonialists sort of came. So how do you feel with some of this conversation just now around the idea that Christianity is a colonial religion, which has kept Black people back in some way? I mean, how do you, obviously you as a Nigerian minister, you find a message of equality and hope within your Roman Catholic faith, don't you? Could you maybe share something of your experience?
Okay, I think when Africans, or even now with the discoveries made so far, say that Ethiopia, that Christianity has been in Ethiopia for a very long time, it's not absolutely wrong, because right from the 1st century AD, we read in the Bible, in the New Testament, Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8, from verse 26 to 36. You remember when Philip met the Ethiopian eunuch, and there Ethiopia entered, in the New Testament. So Christianity has also been in Ethiopia and was made a state religion in Ethiopia by the 4th century AD. However, the Christianity in Ethiopia is kind of different to that of the West Africa or the South Africa, because the West and South Africa received Christianity from missionaries later on, within the ages. They received Christianity, they were ministered to, and they believed and accepted. There are some level of truth from what people are saying about how colonial influences affect Christianity, and because of that, a lot of people are calling for a change to certain Christian beliefs, or actually a total abandonment of Christianity, and then let them go, or let Africans go back to African traditional religion, because we actually have African traditional religion. And from my Igbo tribe of the southeast of Nigeria, we have a very strong, very, very strong religion, which kind of looks similar to a Jewish religion, but not entirely Jewish, but looks similar to that religion. But Christianity, however, is a true religion, I must say, because Christian practices, is more of prophetic. It's more of prophetic, because we discover within ourselves our true nature. We discover our true nature and meaning in God through Christ, and that's what makes us Christians. So Christianity is about following the way of Christ Jesus. And we understand that the Bible also, the Bible gave us lots of examples of prophetic Christianity, like the encounter of our Blessed Virgin Mary in Luke chapter 1, the Zacharias encounter also in Luke chapter 1, Saul's encounter with Jesus himself before he changed his name to Paul, and many other prophetic encounters in the New Testament, especially like the apostles and the disciples who met Jesus. Now, it has to do with personal encounter with Jesus, and that's what Christianity is all about, encountering Jesus and walking the path of Jesus.
Right.
Now, okay, so at baptism, Catholicism reminds us that we have been made priests, prophets, and kings. So we have this, Christ's godly nature in us, that when Christ came, Christ, was a priest, he was a prophet, he was also a king, and he still is. So, and we have been made all this according to the mind of Christ, not according to the mind of the colonialists. So Christianity, even with its colonial influence, still stands, or should still stand, because what matters is that the ideology and the practice of Christianity, which can actually make the world a better place. Now, the issue, I must say, with colonial influence and missionaries, and the issue people have with Christianity is because of the collaboration between colonial masters and the missionaries. In Nigeria, for instance, Christianity actually started coming in, missionaries started coming in from the 15th, 16th century. Missionaries were already coming into Nigeria. They came in through Warri and Benin. There were Augustinians who entered Nigeria from Portuguese. The Portuguese missionaries came into Nigeria earlier on. And then because they couldn't survive, they couldn't find priests, men who could, choose the path of the priesthood. One, they also started collaborating with slave traders. They started also using their power to sell, some Nigerians away from Nigeria, some Benin citizens, some Ishekiris, yes, and Warri as well. So they started shipping humans, so they started committing evil themselves. Secondly, or thirdly, malaria couldn't allow them, because most of them died of malaria. So it's like the light faded. It did not stand at that time until later on in the 18th, 19th century. I think in the 19th century, when the Irish missionaries now started coming into Nigeria to minister to us. And then within that time, there were also colonial masters and colonial influences. Slave trade was still something, within the 18th century, early 18th century. Slave trade was still something. Now, the problem of the people was the fact that the type of education we received, the education we received is another problem, the education. Lisa spoke about image, the image you show. Now, the image we knew of, in fact, that has stuck in our mind of good and bad, in Africa, in Nigeria, is the good. Like the image of God is always white. The image of Satan is always black, right? And then the image of Archangel Michael is always white. The image of Satan is always black. The image of Mary is always white. Stepping on Satan is always black. So it gives us a kind of idea that, okay, we have been negated, like, black has been negated within Christianity. Now that needs to be corrected. Such things like that needs to be corrected. Such things like that needs to be, looked into. So also history. I don't know if Christianity, if missionaries in Nigeria influenced our history or not, but while I was in school, my history did not take me back pre-colonial era or even pre-slave era. All I knew of my history was the discoveries made by the colonial masters, and even the discoveries they made around me, and the fact that they discovered me, literally the fact that they, you understand? So the fact that they discovered me, because almost everything around me were discovered by them according to history. So I grew up believing all these things, and I think it's affecting the minds of the people who then comes to say Christianity has a lot to do with colonialism, that it should be scrapped, which I do not actually stand for. Now, when the second question you asked me was how my Christian faith how I can relate my Christian faith to equality, equity, and human rights. I must say that the joy of Christianity, in the doctrine of Christianity, especially the Catholicism, continues to speak out loud and reminds us all the time that we are all created in the image and the likeness of God. Now we bear the image of God. And St. Paul, in writing to the Galatians, says that with Christ, there is no division. There is no more division. There is no more race. There is no more culture. We have all become one in Christ. So there is no Jew nor Gentile. If you remember St. Paul in Galatians chapter 3 from verse 26 to 28, there is no more Jew, Gentile, or Greek, that we are now all one. So I would like to state a quote here by in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It says that, okay, I'll take it from here. So it says that the equality of men and women rests essentially on their dignity as persons and the rights that flow from it. Dignity as persons, not dignity as race, culture, language, or anything, but dignity as persons, persona. So we are all created in the image and likeness of God. We bear the person of God. Therefore, we must all be respected. And then the Catholic Church also believes that if every one of us should look at each other as another self, it will help. It will totally help the world. Now, Christianity in Europe should not see herself as safe than that in Africa, because they should understand that what happens to an African also affects every other person. What happens to one person affects the other. So there must be that global, what I call global solidarity between Christianity, between Christians. There should be that global solidarity, as well as also within states, and countries. There should also be that global reconciliation and recognition of each other. Now, for instance, there is war in Congo. Congo is suffering. The influence of the West has a lot to do with the sufferings in Congo. There is trouble in Cameroon between the Francophone and Anglophone. They are struggling. There is so much war there. People are dying every day. No one is hearing about it. It's not in the media. But these people are saying Christianity was brought to us by the West, yet they are not considering us who are praying according to the way we have been taught. Now, in Nigeria, there was this uprising a few days ago of the young people who are demanding for justice from their armed forces. Now, how has Christian, not just Catholicism, you understand, Christians as a whole, because in Nigeria you have Pentecostals, Anglicans, Catholics, everyone. Now, how has Christians, contributed to seeing that they take away this injustice that is penetrating into the lives of people in Nigeria and in Africa as a whole? In Congo, I must mention Congo, something needs to be done there quickly, and Cameroon, in Nigeria, and many other places. How has Christians, gathered to see that these come to an end? So I think there should be that global solidarity. That is a solution that I would like to prefer, global solidarity, to see that. And then Christians should be open to collaborate. There should be openness to collaboration, openness to welcome those who are running away from their war-torn areas, openness to share resources. These, I don't know if I've spoken for too long. So,
well, thank you, James. That was quite inspiring and a lot, really important things to say. And a lot of us have really been praying for Nigeria and other areas recently. We are going to just wrap up in a minute. Can I just invite a friend, Benjamin Carey. I don't know if some people know Benjamin. He is a direct descendant of Henry Dundas, and I know that there was a recent documentary on the whole debate around the statue. Benjamin, can you hear us? I can hear you very clearly. Wonderful, Ben. Good evening. Great to join us just at the end. We come to a conclusion. I wonder, Benjamin, you've been listening attentively here as people have been giving their views on, putting statues into museums and what we should be doing in terms of the curriculum. Do you have any views that you want to share with us, Benjamin? Yes, I mean, I agree with Graham, who says that things shouldn't go off to museums, and I mean, I've spent a lot of time listening to Jeff Palmer, who is very keen that we retain statues, but they're properly interpreted. And so some of you might have seen the documentary that was on recently about Scotland slavery and statues. And I'm a descendant of Henry Dundas, Viscount Melville, and most of the contributors from my family are very, very defensive about his name and memory. I think they are factually wrong about much of their interpretation of what he did. But I think the bigger opportunity is to explore how we can learn about the impact that the legacy of the slave trade has had on us, and how we in Britain, I think, have continued to see ourselves as rather exceptional. And I'm currently having a debate with a national newspaper who asked me to write an opinion piece, and I drafted a piece which was really drawing parallels between him as a Tory Home Secretary at the end of the 18th century and Tory Home Secretaries today. And they said what they really want is sort of to explain why I'm fighting with my family. And I think this really misses the point. And rather than, I think it's very self-indulgent to spend a lot of time talking about your long dead family. And I think it's much more important to use what heritage you have access to try and make today a better place. And a lot of people tonight have talked about one humanity, and I've worked in so many of the countries in Africa that have been mentioned. And I'm just very conscious that unless we recognize our one humanity, and also in the old thing of seeing white people as faded black people who have moved away from the equator, there's such an opportunity to recognize that we are one humanity rather than this historical difference which was promoted during the 18th century and today is sort of seen as, well, that was just something of its time and we now need to move on. And I think it's important not to move on and recognize that what is happening today is completely a legacy of the inhumanity of the past. Thank you so much, Benjamin. And I think echo what Graham and others are saying. We've admired your courage, and it's really important that you come out and you're giving a voice, which is I think quite important and leaning quite a lot of weight in this whole discussion. So. Just before we end here, I know we had the moderator of the Church of Scotland. I don't know if he is still here and would like to say something just before. He's maybe on silent. I don't know if he's still there. Well, Well, I think this has been quite a moving event. And Martin, you are here. Wonderful. I wonder if you want to say a few words. We have the moderator of the Church of Scotland, Martin, here with us. How are you, Martin?
I'm absolutely well, Ian, and actually all the better for the last period of time. I don't feel that I want to add anything to it or make any particular responses to what I've heard. I actually feel very humbled by the whole experience, and there's a very important move that has to be made by people like me, just to listen. And in humility, just to listen. And I mean, I could say maybe 100 things, but tonight for me has been hearing. And every single one of the contributors has moved me in one way or another. Some very practically. Tomorrow I'm going to go along to the graveyard at St. John's here in Edinburgh and look out that grave, and maybe I'll look for another opportunity to do one of those walks that we heard about from Lisa. So there'll be some things that I'll do, but I'm going to leave it at that. I've just been moved and humbled, and I'm very glad that I was here tonight.
Thank you very much, Martin. Would any one of our panelists, does anyone want to share something just before we come to an end?
Do we have time for a quick prayer, Baha'i prayer, or is that? I have
no objections to it. I don't know if anybody else is okay.
It sort of represents, this whole one humankind thing, and just thank you so much for indulging it. O thou kind Lord, thou hast created all humanity from the same stock. Thou hast decreed that all shall belong to the same household. In thy holy presence they are all thy servants, and all mankind are sheltered beneath thy tabernacle. All have gathered together at thy table of bounty. All are illumined through the light of thy providence. O God, thou art kind to all. Thou hast provided for all, dost shelter all, conferrest life upon all. Thou hast endowed each and all with talents and faculties, and all is submerged in the ocean of thy mercy. O thou kind Lord, unite all, let the religions agree, and make the nations one, so that they may see each other as one family, and the whole earth as one home. May they all live together in perfect harmony. O God, raise aloft the banner of the oneness of mankind. O God, establish the most great peace. Cement, O God, the hearts together. O thou kind Father God, gladden our hearts through the fragrance of thy love, brighten our eyes through the light of thy guidance, delight our ears with the melody of thy word, and shelter us all in the stronghold of thy providence. Thou art the mighty and powerful, thou art the forgiving, and thou art the one who overlooketh the shortcomings of all mankind.
Thank you. That was very beautiful. It just leaves me just to thank the speakers. I know I'm going to take an awful lot away from tonight. As Martin was saying, some very practical things, but also some a lot of knowledge and I think some hope as well that things are changing. I do feel that the revolution is changing, and I think we all have to kind of move together and ensure that we're heard and the changes do take place. So I just thank for everyone coming, thank for everyone for watching, and please everyone out there, just leave any feedback, any comments that you have, and join us soon for the next webinar. So